Hello, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that explores some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my experiences in those countries, as well as their geopolitics, their culture, and their history. This is the first episode of season two of Some Stops Along the Way podcast, and I'm really glad that you're here, and I hope you enjoy it. Of course, the podcast is a companion to my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, which you can find on Amazon. The book relays a lot of my experiences in working in countries around the world, including the one I'm going to talk about today. Talks about some of the interesting people that I've met and the experiences that I've had, and I think that you would enjoy it as a companion to this podcast. So reach out on Amazon if you're interested in that. So before we get into talking about a new country, let me tell you a little bit about what to expect from the Some Stops Along the Way podcast during 2026. I'm going to be bringing in some guests. I've got a couple that are going to be joining me in January. In fact, two really interesting people are going to join me in January, and I think that you will want to tune in for them. One of them is the mayor of the Ukrainian city of Trosniets. His name is Yuri Bova. Yuri will be joining me to talk more about what is happening in Ukraine, how the municipalities like Trosniets in Ukraine are dealing with this period of war, what they see for reconstruction. You're going to really get some insight into Ukraine through the lens of someone who is living it every single day and who's responsible for leading a municipality during this very challenging time in the country's history. You're also going to be hearing from my friend Gershon Boskin, who is going to join me for an episode of Some Stops Along the Way. Gershon is one of the foremost authorities on Israel and Palestine, and he'll be talking about the long-term prospects for peace in the region, how he believes that could unfold, and he's going to unpack some of the recent events that have both supported and detracted from the peace process. I've mentioned Gershon previously on the podcast, but he will be joining us in just a few weeks to discuss some really important issues, and I'm sure that you will want to tune in there. So I'm going to have some very powerful guests on in 2026, starting with Yuri and Gershon, but continuing on with some others. I'm going to try to do 1 to 2 guests per month, in addition to the normal format of my relaying the experiences in different countries around the world. So I think it'll be an interesting season two for Some Stops Along the Way, and I hope that you will tune in and like and subscribe so that you'll get updates on future episodes. They always drop every Monday morning at 8 a.m., but also so that you will pass on your recommendation to others to subscribe to the podcast as well. So, on this first episode of season two, we're going to delve into a country that is often discussed, very misunderstood, and one that is both complicated and simplistic at the same time. It's a dichotomy. And we'll be discussing that dichotomy over the next couple of episodes. That country is the People's Republic of China. I first worked in China in the early 2000s, and it was every trip there was a real eye opener, so to speak. I, some of my earliest experiences there were were mesmerizing and confusing and complicated, but at the same time, I learned a great deal and I absolutely enjoyed every day that I spent working in the country because it was like a learning laboratory. And fortunately, I had people there who were very gracious and who were patient in teaching me how to do business there and how to make an impact while I was there. And I'll be talking about that more in just a few moments. But as with every country where I've ever worked, there were both successes and challenges. But there were always people there that I could depend on to help me work through whatever challenges arose. And in this case, I had two people who I'm most dependent on. They were my quote unquote handlers while I was there, very similar to the handler that I had in Vietnam while I was there, someone that the government assigns to work with you and to more or less keep an eye on you and ensure that that you don't delve into areas that the government would rather you not delve into. But in my case, I had two such people, Sami and Ma, both very intelligent, urbane, and inquisitive young ladies that I grew very attached to. And they taught me a great deal about the mindset of, pardon me, pardon me, the mindset of the Chinese government and the Chinese people, because they were representatives, after all, of the Chinese government. But I digress a little bit. When I first went to China, I had a project that began in Shanghai, and so I was getting ready to fly to Shanghai to begin that project. And before I left the airport, I got a message from my colleague John, who had gone on ahead to China, saying that when you get there, I'm likely going to be in meetings, but I've left a message for you at the front desk of the hotel. Make sure and pick up the message, and then I will catch up with you as soon as I get back from my meetings. Well, that turned out to be prophetic because not only was he pulled into a lot of meetings, but my flight was delayed, and it ended up I didn't get to Shanghai until about 18 hours after I anticipated that I would get there. So I was very late. I landed early in the morning in Pudong Airport in Shanghai. And once I cleared immigration and customs and connected with my driver, it was late in the morning by the time that I arrived at the hotel. I was extremely exhausted, having waited around the airport, had to deal with delayed flights, and even with the business class flight, I hadn't slept very much. I'd been doing a lot of prep work for the project, and I was really tired. So I got to the hotel, I checked in, got to my room, was getting sorted out, and then realized that I hadn't picked up the message. So I said, okay. I didn't want to go all. I was on one of the top floors of the hotel. Pardon me. And the last thing I wanted to do was take the elevator down and start that whole process. So I picked up the phone in my room. I got the front desk and I said, "This is Mr. McCord." Gave my room number, and I've got a message. Can you bring it to my room? And no response. I said, "A message. Uh, I need my message." No response. I just kept repeating that over and over because that's what people do when they don't speak the language, and evidently we think that that will help us be better understood to talk louder and to keep repeating the same word over and over. It's ridiculous, but that's what I did. So I kept saying a message. I need my message. And finally, the front desk clerk said, "Oh, yes, 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 yes. Very soon, very soon." Click. So I said, "Okay, well, fine." So about 5 minutes later, there's a knock on my door. I open the door. Here is a young lady who is standing there with massage oil. And I realize that there's been a very big miscommunication. She's trying to come into the room. I'm trying to push her out of the room. I'm saying, no, 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 message, message, message. Yeah, yeah, massage, massage. No, no, message, not massage, message, message. And I'm trying to push her out. She's trying to come in. I finally get her outside the room. I shut the door. I lock it. I go over to the phone. I call the front desk. Said, message, 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 not massage, no massage, no massage, message, message. And finally, after 2 or 3 minutes, front desk clerk, "Oh, yes, 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 yes. Very soon." Click. A few minutes later, knock on the door. I'm afraid to answer it this time. So I look through the keyhole, and here's this same young lady, but she's holding up my message. I open the door. She hands me smiles graciously, hands me my message. Same young lady that had massage oil before was holding my message that time. That's an odd story in itself, but whatever. So when my friend got back to the hotel, I said a couple things. First of all, never leave me a message at a hotel again. Secondly, make sure that my minders are meet me at the airport so I don't have snafus like this in the future. And so on my return trips to China, Sammy and Ma always were there to collect me at the airport. At this point in time, I hadn't met them yet. I didn't meet them until the following day prior to my afternoon meetings. And as I said, they were intelligent young women. They were very gregarious. They spoke flawless English. And unlike my minder in Vietnam, they were very supportive, if you will, of American influence and very inquisitive about my role specifically during my trip. So I quickly built a great relationship with Sami and Ma, and we began our work with government officials, and then we toured a number of private sector companies. One of my roles there was to build the capacity of business organizations to better communicate and interact with government counterparts. But there's also an economic aspect to it as well. And so we toured a lot of companies, we toured industrial parks, and it was over the next few days that I really fell in love with Shanghai as a city. In the evenings after our work, Sami and Ma would take me to an interesting part of the city. That first night, they took me to the Bund, which has a very European look about it, even though it's in Shanghai. And We enjoyed great food, uh, excellent Chinese culture. One of the things I love to do is to get into the old part of the city and walk through the markets. And one night, as Sammy and Ma and I were walking through one of the markets, I saw a a man making dumplings. He was dressed as a chef in his white smock and his white hat, and he was making these dumplings, and steam from the dumplings was rising up. And I snapped a photo, and when I looked at the photo, it became one of my favorites because I had accidentally, and usually when I take a really good photo, it is by accident. My wife is a fantastic photographer, and she has an eye for what makes a good photo. I really don't. So if I take a good picture, it is by accident. And this one accidentally was an excellent picture because it had him there with the dumplings and the steam rising around him, and it really captured the essence of that marketplace, that old part of Shanghai. But the more I worked there, and the more that I talked to Sammy and Ma, I became acutely aware of the dichotomy of China. Because I'd been to Beijing before, and of course it's changed a great deal now, but Beijing was really what I call old school China. It was, of course, the seat of government, but Beijing had that feel of an older, steeped in tradition Chinese city. Whereas Shanghai and other cities that I traveled to, but Shanghai especially, had a very international feel about it. I mean, if you didn't know better when you were standing on the Bund, you would think you were in Europe. But the dichotomy wasn't just in modernization, if you will. The dichotomy was really in everything. Um, at that time, and even still to this day, China was trying to integrate a more liberal economic system rather than a state controlled, a solely state controlled system. And so there was a lot of dichotomy in their economy as well. Um, you may or may not know that China the second most um, is the second most populous country in the world, and it is one of the largest countries in the world. But it's a dichotomy in that the the differentiation between the rich and the poor in the country is very stark. I mean, here's a country that has 17% of the world's population. It and India together have 17% of the world's population. China has 1.4 billion people. It's a huge country. It's bordered by 14 different countries. It has an area of 9.6 million square kilometers. That's 3,700,000 or so square miles. It's the third largest country by area in the world. It has 33 different province level divisions, 22 provinces, 5 autonomous regions, 4 municipalities, and 2 semi autonomous special administrative regions. And its capital, Beijing, is not even the largest city in the country. Shanghai is the most populous city. and it's the financial center of the country. So Beijing is the political center of the country, and Shanghai is really the economic and financial center of the country. We were raised in the United States to during the Cold War to especially fear Russia. And I talked about that early on in year one of some Stops Along the Way podcast about my work in Russia. But of course, we were taught to be very wary of the Chinese as well, because the Chinese were communists. We had fought against China and the Korean communists in the Korean conflict. So unlike Russia, we had actually taken arms against the Chinese army. We had fought the Chinese directly in Korea. In some ways, in my mind, and this is totally my opinion, the Cold War with Russia was somewhat less complicated than our relationship with China. And that was for a lot of reasons. The influence of Stalin, Khrushchev, and the people that came after them, up until of course 1989, the Gorbachev era, when the Soviet Union splintered. The relationship between the United States government had always been problematic and antagonistic. It was somewhat with China as well, although our relationship with the Chinese was somewhat different. It was somewhat more below the surface than our relationship with Russia. And the interesting thing about the Chinese government is that in the 1970s, they began movement toward a more liberalized economy. They were moving away from a planned economy and toward more of a market-based economy. This is the same thing that Vietnam did and is still doing to this day. That didn't change their governmental structure. They still are steeped in the communist mentality, but they recognized that movement toward the market-based economy was going to achieve the goals that they wanted to achieve. Unlike the Russians, the Chinese, outside of Korea, had predominantly stayed out of conflicts with other nations. They didn't have the war in Afghanistan like the Russians had, the invasions of Ukraine, the invasions in Georgia. They didn't have any of that. There was antagonism toward Taiwan, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But for the most part, they focused on their internal objectives, and they tried to do this balancing act between the communist mentality, but the liberalization of the economy. And a key piece to that was gaining control of Hong Kong, which was handed over to the Chinese by Britain in January of 2000. And I'll talk more about Hong Kong, where I also worked extensively, in a future episode relative to its connection with China. But anyone who tries to exposit that the Chinese are not ultimately as dangerous, if you will, as the Russians. I think missed the point. And I'm saying this from the position that I enjoyed working in China very much. And I saw a lot of the reforms that the Chinese were implementing at the time that I was there and that are still happening to this day. I saw them as movement in the right direction. But when you look at how China does its business around the world, you see that this strategy can be it's very subtle, it's very business oriented, but it can be very concerning to the interest of the West, including the United States. Let me give you an example. As part of this economic liberalization process, the Chinese began to exude influence around the world, not as much political influence or diplomatic influence as economic influence. This was especially true in Africa, where I worked extensively, and we'll be getting into a lot of my work in African countries later in season 2 of Some Stops Along the Way podcast. But in virtually every country where I worked in Africa, I saw China's influence in real time. I had a front row seat to it. Because what the Chinese would do is build relations with these countries, many of whom were facing severe economic challenges, and they would loan them money to develop their infrastructure, to build new roads, to build new bridges, to build airports, in some cases to build seaports, to build major infrastructure projects. China would loan them the money on the proviso that they would use Chinese firms for the construction, and that China would enter into some type of an agreement to build, operate, and transfer that infrastructure to the countries once it was completed. This not only created debt within the countries, but it created this economic connection to the Chinese that was very strong and very long in duration. As a matter of fact, it was said that in many African countries mortgaged themselves to the Chinese. But what other choice did they have? The Chinese came with the money to provide something that these countries desperately needed, which was infrastructure. And whether or not they realized it, maybe they didn't care. All this money, all this support came with strings attached. And that is, you continue to build China's economic interest by utilizing Chinese firms, but also now you are tied economically to China for years to come. So this was a very economically oriented but subtle way to exude diplomatic influence on countries around the world. Because literally, the repayment of these loans for infrastructure came with a lot of contingencies that benefited the Chinese. So this was part of their foreign policy. The Russian foreign policy focused more on protecting their political interest and domination. Um, Invasion of Ukraine, full scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, invasion of Crimea, uh, invasion of Ossetia, of South Ossetia in Georgia, invasion of Abkhazia, war in Syria, the war in Afghanistan. Okay, China avoided all of that. China's philosophy was, we're going to exert control through economic influence. That's what they've done, and they've done it very, very successfully. You may or may not know that China has purchased large blocks of American farmland. They are investors in American companies. So this is not just a third world or an emerging economy issue. The Chinese economic net has been cast wide around the world. And Sammy and Ma um, really helped me understand this philosophy much better through the long conversations that we had over breakfast, lunches, and dinners, and on traveling around the country. They helped me understand the philosophy behind the country's liberalization, economic liberalization, but also its foreign policy. And I think that that is something that is quite interesting, and that we're going to unpack in a future episode. Um, China has a complicated internal history as well, not just an external history, but it has a very complicated internal history. You've heard of rulers like Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong. We'll unpack their influence on the country in future episodes as well. But suffice it to say that 1949 was the seminal date in Chinese history as far as its relationship with the West, because that is when the communists drove Chiang Kai shek out of the country to Taiwan and established the People's Republic of China. Um, at that time, the country was desperately poor, very taciturn. It was this large landmass with huge numbers of people to support, but really lacked the direction, pardon me, to do that. Since that time, China has become the second wealthiest country in the world. But in doing so, it continues to rank poorly in the areas of democracy and human rights. It's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It's the world's largest manufacturer and exporter. It's also the second largest importer in the world. It's a nuclear state. It has the world's largest standing army and the second largest defense budget. It is a legitimate superpower. And this happened under the communist government, and it happened not through global conflicts and domination, but through the convergence of economic, of liberalized economic growth with the continued philosophy of the ruling government. So when I was there, I really looked closely at what was happening in the country at that time. And this was a period where there were major reforms taking place almost all the time. And everybody in the government was really wanting to talk about the liberalized economy and the reforms that were taking place. They were very open and friendly people. We would often get stopped in the streets and people just wanted to take a photo or talk. Um, in they were not as standoffish as the Russians. They were not as petulant as the Russians. Although I had many friends during my years in working in Russia as well, as you know from previous episodes of this podcast. But they were very outgoing, gregarious people. And virtually anywhere in the country you went, you would be greeted with smiles and hospitality. Now, there were, of course, reticence in some areas. I don't want to overstate it. But the people were, for the most part, extremely friendly. In the times that I traveled outside of the major cities, if you will, of Beijing and Shanghai, I really found rural China to be fascinating. It was like literally going back in time. When you left Shanghai, especially with its its tall buildings and its modern streets and highways and its beautifully manicured byways, in this bustling environment, and you got out into the rural areas very quickly, you would see this marked contrast between the level of wealth in places like Beijing and Shanghai and the relative level of poverty in the rural areas. Now, keep in mind that there are huge cities all over China. It's a very populous country. So cities like Guangzhou, for instance, very large cities, each of them unique in their own way. And that doesn't even count the influence of Hong Kong, which for years was one of the powerhouses of economic growth in that entire region. That in the year 2000 was annexed, if you will, by China. It was literally given back by the British to China after years of rule. But there is a limit to where the Chinese are willing to go as far as this liberalization. And Sammy and Ma and I used to have a lot of debates about this, because I would tease them about cherry picking the low fruit from the capitalist economy, but not really embracing it to its full extent, because capitalism ultimately is driven by the market itself, by market forces. And the government's role in a market economy or in a capitalistic economy is to ensure that there are rules in place to make those market forces as fair as they can possibly be. What we've seen since Hong Kong reverted to China in the early 2000s is this progressive political crackdown on Hong Kong that has diminished its economic vitality. And Sammy and Ma never agreed with this, and we would argue about it in a friendly way constantly. But I've likened the approach that China has taken in Hong Kong to attempting to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Hong Kong was a powerhouse economy under the British, and it remains an important part, an important economic force in the region to this day. But now, under Chinese control, it has become a flashpoint for this convergence of a communist political philosophy with a an area or a city state, if you will, that was very much driven by market forces, and that convergence has created friction. It hasn't been easy. There have been significant crackdowns by the Chinese government in Hong Kong. Um, Hong Kong is a different type of animal than Shanghai, which is a financial center on the mainland of China. And it's been treated as such. So during my time there, I likened China to be an enigma wrapped in a riddle. I don't know that anyone can ever totally understand, who's not Chinese, could totally understand the vast dichotomy that exists in virtually every area of Chinese life, but especially in this overlay of a more market centered approach with the communist mentality. It's a very fine line to walk. And I found very few Chinese politicians while I was there who were maybe not overtly, but at least subtly concerned about how they could walk that tightrope into the future. Although, when you look at how the Chinese economy is growing, when you look at how the influence that they are exhibiting now around the world in a variety of countries, as I said, not just what we would consider quote unquote third world countries, they're exerting influence around the globe from an economic standpoint. When you look at that, you realize that the Chinese may be onto something, and that certainly in being distracted all those years by the Cold War, and then having our own diplomatic interest post Cold War, we quite possibly had not given enough credence to the fact that while the United States and the West was doing all of this, China was becoming the builder, the producer, and the banker for a large part of the world. And that continues to this day, and their economic growth continues to this day. So, in the next episode of Some Stops Along the Way, we are going to look more deeply into China's history, culture, and geopolitics to determine how they came to this point of economic growth, how they turned a huge country that was very steeped in history, very taciturn in terms of its ability to care for its people, into what now can only be considered an economic powerhouse. Join me on the next episode of Some Stops Along the Way, and I think you'll learn a lot about how China has become what it is today and what the future holds for China and its influence on the rest of the world as well as understanding more about how China's own people view the multiple dichotomies within their government, their economic relations, and everyday life. Until then, again, have a happy, happy new year, and we will see you next time on some stops along the way.